The wind was a mournful cry. It tore through the jagged teeth of Widow's Pass. Snow, fine and relentless, fell like a shroud. It gathered in deep drifts against the gnarled pines. These were not healthy trees. Their bark was scarred, clawed by something immense, something furious. The marks were stark against the pale wood, telling a silent story of violence. This place held no peace. It offered no solace. Only a biting cold and the echo of ancient sorrows. The air itself felt thin, brittle, as if ready to shatter. Bones lay scattered. They were half buried in the unforgiving frost. Some were animal, others disturbingly were not. They peeked from the snow, stark white against the encroaching grey of the afternoon. A low growl rumbled in the distance. It was a sound that vibrated deep in the chest. It was a promise of teeth and hunger. The pass was a place of endings. It was a place where things went to die or to be consumed. It whispered of despair. It reeked of fear. The very name, Widow's Pass, hung heavy. It spoke of loss, of loved ones vanished into the frigid embrace of the wilderness. Each gust of wind seemed to carry their unheard pleas, their final desperate cries. The high desert frontier was a harsh mistress. But this pass, it was something more. It was a wound on the land, festering with an unseen malignancy. The silence between the wind's howls was profound. It was a heavy, waiting silence, a silence that knew secrets. The snow continued its ceaseless descent. It covered the tracks of whatever hunted here. It muffled the sounds of struggle, but it could not erase the feeling of being watched by unseen eyes, the feeling of a primal hunger that permeated the stones, the trees, the very air. This was not just a wilderness, this was a hunting ground, and something monstrous was the undisputed master of its domain. The cold seeped into marrow. It was a cold beyond weather. From the dark edge of the tree line, a figure emerged. It was a stark contrast to the white and grey desolation. A black horse, powerful and steed-like, moved with an unnatural grace. Fog rose from its dark, sweating flanks, mingling with the falling snow. The mare's name was Nocturne. Her breath plumed in the frigid air. She carried her rider with a steady, unwavering gait. She seemed untroubled by the oppressive atmosphere of the pass, or perhaps she was simply accustomed to such dread. Her rider was a silhouette against the dying light. Alucard Caine. His form was cloaked, the heavy fabric shielding him from the wind's bite. A wide-brimmed hat cast his face in deep shadow. Only the stern set of his jaw was occasionally visible. He sat tall in the saddle. His hands, gloved and steady, held the reins lightly. He was a figure of grim purpose. He did not belong to this land, yet he moved through it as if it were an old, familiar enemy. Caine's presence was a disturbance. It was a new element in the pass's equation of suffering. He was not a victim. He was not prey. His eyes, though hidden, seemed to scan the surroundings with an unnerving intensity. He absorbed the details of the clawed trees, the scattered bones, the biting wind. He was a collector of grim truths. The silence of the past did not unnerve him. It seemed to welcome him like a kindred spirit. He was a part of the encroaching darkness. Nocturne moved onward, her hooves making little sound on the snow-covered trail. The distant drums, like faint, anxious heartbeats, seemed to follow them. Or perhaps they emanated from the rider himself. He was a harbinger. He was a hunter. The nature of his quarry was yet unknown to the pass, but the pass itself seemed to hold its breath. A new predator had entered its cursed domain, and the ancient evil stirred in recognition, or perhaps in anticipation. Nocturne's hooves finally struck harder ground. The soft crunch of snow gave way to the hollow echo on frozen mud. They had reached the edge of Widow's Pass town. The settlement was a collection of weathered wooden buildings. They huddled together as if for warmth, or for protection against the vast, menacing wilderness that surrounded them. The air here felt even tighter. It was thick with unspoken fears and the stench of decay. A different kind of cold resided here, the cold of human dread. As Caine rode slowly down the deserted main street, movement flickered behind grimy windows. Faces peered out from behind hastily drawn curtains. Eyes watched him. They were filled with suspicion, with a weary terror. No one emerged. No doors opened. The town was a creature holding its breath, waiting for him to pass, or waiting for him to bring further misfortune. The silence was absolute, broken only by the rhythmic clopping of Nocturne's hooves and the sigh of the wind. From the shadowed doorway of a dilapidated church, a man watched. It was the sheriff. He held a rifle clutched tightly in his hands. His face was grim, etched with worry, but he made no move to approach. He simply stood there, a silent, impotent guardian of a town already lost. His presence was a testament to the failure of ordinary defenses against the horrors that plagued this place. He watched Caine with a mixture of apprehension and perhaps a desperate, unvoiced hope. Alucard Caine dismounted. His movements were slow, deliberate. He gave Nocturne a soft pat on the neck. Then his gaze swept across the street. It was a methodical assessment. His eyes, still shadowed by his hat, seemed to miss nothing. They lingered for a moment on a gruesome sight. A small animal carcass, perhaps a coyote or a large fox, was nailed crudely to a wooden post. This was Widow's Pass. This was the welcome. The air in Widow's Pass congealed. Alucard Caine led Nocturne down the desolate main street. Each step amplified the unnatural stillness. Her hooves echoed a lonely drumbeat. The sound bounced off weathered facades. This town was a tomb, its inhabitants ghosts. From behind threadbare curtains, eyes watched, glints of white in the gloom, wide with fear. The townsfolk were like mice, frozen by fear. They watched the stranger, this dark rider. Was he another harbinger of doom, or something else entirely? Faces etched with hardship and dread. Caine felt their gazes upon him, like 1,000 tiny needles pricking his skin. He was accustomed to such scrutiny. He moved with deliberate calmness. The town's fear was a familiar scent, the perfume of despair, a community on the brink. Nocturne sensed the oppressive atmosphere, her loyalty unwavering. She had carried him through worse. The silent judgment did not deter her. Dust motes hung suspended, afraid to move. Widow's Pass was a wound weeping silent misery. Standing in the shadowed archway of what passed for a church, a lone figure offered a more overt yet equally powerless observation. This was the town sheriff. His face was a mask of grim resignation. A rifle was clutched in his hands. He watched Alucard Caine's slow progress with suspicion.
He was a guardian who could no longer guard.
The church itself offered little solace. Its wooden frame was dilapidated. It was less a house of God and more a monument to faith lost. The sheriff's position in its doorway seemed symbolic. He stood at the threshold of broken belief. He made no move to approach Caine. He was a statue of impotence in a dying town.
Alucard dismounted with a slow, deliberate grace.
He gave Nocturne a reassuring pat. Then his shadowed gaze began its methodical sweep of the street. It was the gaze of a predator. He absorbed every detail. His eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, missed nothing. They were accustomed to peering into the darkest corners of existence. It fixed upon a gruesome spectacle nailed to a weathered wooden post. The sight was a raw, visceral testament to the savagery that gripped Widow's Pass. It was a crude effigy of terror. The sheriff watched Caine watch the carcass. No expression crossed the lawman's face. There were no words to be said. The horror spoke for itself. The town's plight was displayed for any newcomer to witness. The animal carcass was small, perhaps a coyote or a wild dog. It was nailed crudely, its limbs splayed in a grotesque parody of crucifixion. Its fur was matted with dried blood and dirt. But it was the eyes, or rather the lack of them, that seized the attention. They had been gouged out, leaving only hollow, staring sockets that seemed to accuse the very sky. This was not the work of an ordinary predator. This was a message, a brutal declaration of dominance by something that reveled in cruelty, something that understood the power of fear. It was a stark emblem of the town's torment. Alucard Caine regarded the savaged remains without visible emotion. His face, still mostly obscured by shadow, remained impassive. If the sight disturbed him, he gave no sign. He had witnessed far worse atrocities in his long, dark existence. This was merely another verse in the endless, mournful song of suffering that humanity and its myriad tormentors composed. He took a slow breath, the cold, thin air doing little to dilute the faint, coppery scent of old blood that clung to the macabre display. This was the welcome widow's pass offered, a silent, blood-stained scream. After a moment, he turned away from the gruesome totem. His attention shifted towards the largest and perhaps only functioning establishment in the vicinity, the saloon. Its windows were dark, but a faint flickering light hinted at life within, however subdued. It was the natural gathering place in a frontier town, a hub of information, of fear, and sometimes of desperate courage. Caine's stride was unhurried yet purposeful as he moved towards its swinging doors. Nocturne remained where he had left her, a stoic black statue against the grey backdrop of the town. The saloon doors creaked ominously as Caine pushed them inward. The sound was unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the street. It was as if the town itself flinched at this intrusion. He stepped across the threshold, leaving the biting wind and the bleak daylight behind. He entered a world of shadows, stale liquor, and the palpable dread of men who lived too close to the edge of oblivion. The faint murmur of hushed conversation, the clink of a glass, the shuffling of cards, all of it ceased abruptly as he entered. Every eye turned towards him. The animal carcass was small, perhaps a coyote or a wild dog. It was nailed crudely, its limbs splayed in a grotesque parody of crucifixion. Its fur was matted with dried blood and dirt. But it was the eyes, or rather the lack of them, that seized the attention. They had been gouged out, leaving only hollow, staring sockets that seemed to accuse the very sky. This was not the work of an ordinary predator. This was a message, a brutal declaration of dominance by something that reveled in cruelty, something that understood the power of fear. It was a stark emblem of the town's torment. Alucard Caine regarded the savaged remains without visible emotion. His face, still mostly obscured by shadow, remained impassive. If the sight disturbed him, he gave no sign. He had witnessed far worse atrocities in his long, dark existence. This was merely another verse in the endless, mournful song of suffering that humanity and its myriad tormentors composed. He took a slow breath, the cold, thin air doing little to dilute the faint, coppery scent of old blood that clung to the macabre display. This was the welcome widow's pass offered, a silent, blood-stained scream. After a moment, he turned away from the gruesome totem. His attention shifted towards the largest and perhaps only functioning establishment in the vicinity, the saloon. Its windows were dark, but a faint, flickering light hinted at life within, however subdued. It was the natural gathering place in a frontier town, a hub of information, of fear, and sometimes of desperate courage. Caine's stride was unhurried yet purposeful as he moved towards its swinging doors. Nocturne remained where he had left her, a stoic black statue against the grey backdrop of the town. The saloon doors creaked ominously as Caine pushed them inward. The sound was unnaturally loud in the oppressive silence of the street. It was as if the town itself flinched at. The saloon was dim, lit by sputtering oil lamps casting long shadows. The air was thick with the smell of cheap whiskey and fear. Every patron froze mid-motion. A man lowered his glass slowly. Another held cards suspended in mid-air. The piano tune died as the musician's fingers stiffened. Alucard Caine paid no heed. His gaze swept the room before he moved to the wall of wanted posters. His dark cloak swirled as he walked. He produced a worn, folded piece of paper. He pinned it to the wall with a sharp tack. The paper was a bounty poster. The poster read, "Unknown creature, last seen in the pass. $300 bounty." The sum was considerable. Below the words, a crude drawing depicted a monstrous figure. Caine stepped back, his face unreadable. The silence in the saloon stretched, taut and fragile. Every person stared at the poster, then at the stranger. The bartender finally broke the silence. He was pale and sweaty. He wiped his hands nervously on a stained apron.
"That thing," he began, his voice raspy, barely above a whisper. "That thing's not natural. Took 6 last month. Good men. Vanished without a trace." He paused, swallowing hard. "Took the preacher's boy."
Caine turned slowly, his gaze meeting the bartender's.
"Not the first monster I've met," Alucard replied softly.
In a cold, dimly lit room, Alucard Caine began his preparations. The room was cold, the only heat from a small, inefficient stove. He lit a single tallow candle. Shadows danced on the wooden walls. His weary eyes moved with precision. He unpacked his belongings from a worn leather satchel. These were not the possessions of an ordinary traveler. Silver bullets, a blessed blade, and a vial of black earth. These were the tools of his grim trade. He retrieved an old blood-stained journal. The journal chronicled horrors and survival. He read a chilling passage. "Famine incarnate. Avoid the caves." The night outside deepened, the wind howled. Alucard Caine was ready to meet the monster of Widow's Pass. Alucard Caine moved through the shadowed lanes of Widow's Pass. His destination was a small, ramshackle cabin at the edge of the settlement. Here lived a mother whose grief was a fresh, raw wound in the town's collective suffering. He found her by a cold hearth, her form hunched, her eyes staring into embers that offered no warmth, no solace. The air in the cabin was heavy with the scent of wood smoke, and a despair so profound it felt like a physical weight. She did not look up as he entered, her sorrow a shroud that rendered the world beyond her pain invisible. He did not offer empty comforts. His presence was stark, his purpose clear. He spoke softly, his voice a low rumble that barely disturbed the funereal quiet. He asked about her son, his name, his habits, the last time she saw him.
My boy had gone hunting just as he always did. He knew the woods. He was strong. He was meant to return before dusk, but the sun had set many times since his departure, each dawn a fresh wave of agony.
Caine listened with an unnerving stillness. His shadowed face betrayed no emotion, yet his attention was absolute. He absorbed every detail, every tremor in her voice, every flicker of pain in her haunted eyes. He was no stranger to loss, though his own griefs were ancient, buried deep beneath centuries of ice. He understood the contours of her despair, the jagged edges of a love violently torn away. He knew the shape of the void left behind. The boy was another offering to the hunger that stalked this land, another life extinguished too soon. She clutched a small, crudely carved wooden bird. Her son had made it. Her fingers traced its worn shape, a desperate connection to what was lost. She spoke of his laughter, of his dreams of leaving this blighted place. Caine knew such dreams rarely survived places like Widow's Pass. The wilderness here had an insatiable appetite for hope. As she spoke, the wind outside seemed to moan in sympathy or perhaps in mockery. He had heard what he needed. Another thread in the tapestry of terror, another soul to account for. Leaving the cabin's oppressive sorrow behind, Alucard Caine made his way to the tree line. This was where the known world ended and the domain of the beast began. The snow lay thicker here, a pristine white blanket disturbed only by the skeletal fingers of barren bushes. He moved with a hunter's focus, his gaze sweeping the ground, missing nothing. A patch of snow, unnaturally disturbed, stained a sickening dark crimson. Further on, half buried in the bloodied snow, he found a tooth, something that belonged to the nightmares of men. The evidence painted a grim picture, confirming the tales, underscoring the terror. His investigation next led him to the town's dilapidated church. The structure stood forlorn, its paint peeling, its windows boarded or broken. It was a place that should have offered sanctuary, a bastion against the encroaching darkness. Instead, it felt defiled, its sacredness leached away by the pervasive evil that held Widow's Pass in its grip. The door creaked open under his touch, revealing an interior filled with shadows and the scent of decay. The silence within was heavy like a held breath. A crucifix lay on the dusty floor, melted and twisted. This was a deliberate act of sacrilege, a statement of contempt for any holy power. The air around the desecrated symbol felt colder, charged with a lingering malevolence. Caine moved deeper into the gloom, his boots echoing on the warped floorboards. The church was no longer a shield, it was a tombstone, marking the death of hope. Caine sought Old Feather, an elder with ancient knowledge. He found him by the dark, sluggish river. His face was a tapestry of wrinkles, eyes holding wisdom. He laid stones in ritual patterns, each placement meaningful. He noticed his approach, eyes sharp and observant. He straightened, his gaze fixing on him. He knew why he had come.
The hunger you seek. It has many names. Wendigo, shadow that walks.
He gestured to the desolate landscape.
It is hunger, a spirit of insatiable want.
His words painted a chilling portrait of a metaphysical blight.
You hunt this shadow?
He asked, his gaze piercing.
Yes.
He replied, the single word carrying the weight of his purpose.
Then you are not the first monster seeking penance.
His words hung in the cold air, a subtle accusation. Old Feather reached into a worn leather pouch at her belt. She produced a small talisman, crafted from a shard of polished black obsidian and tied with strands of rawhide.
This will offer some small protection. If it turns hot, the hunger is near. If it cracks, run.
Caine held the talisman, a memory piercing through his stoic facade.
I've seen what starvation does, but this Wendigo, it wears famine like a crown.
He remembered examining massive clawed tracks in the snow, the cursed heat radiating from the earth. He secured the talisman to his wrist, a small comfort in his long existence. He gave Old Feather a curt nod of acknowledgement. Later, in his rented room, he laid out his revolver and loaded the silver bullets with practiced precision. He drew his blessed blade, whispering the ancient words.
In tenebris, Lux.
In darkness light, his hunt was about to truly begin. The lone candle flame threw dancing shadows across the rough-hewn walls of Caine's small room. He etched tiny, intricate runes onto the silver bullets with a bone needle. These were ancient bindings, prayers to forgotten gods. He worked in silence, transforming each bullet into a focused point of his grim will. When the last rune was carved, he rose and donned his heavy greatcoat. He took up the obsidian talisman, feeling its faint thrumming. He tied it securely around his wrist, a fragile ward against immense darkness. He clenched his fist, the obsidian a hard, reassuring presence. Finally, he turned towards the door. Nocturne would be waiting in the biting cold of the Widow's Pass night. He paused, his hand on the latch.
You've outrun worse things, girl.
It was a shared understanding, a compact between rider and steed. He opened the door and stepped out into the frozen, waiting darkness. The forest received Caine like a gaping maw. Snow fell steadily, creating an eerie, muffled world. The only sound was the soft crunch of his boots and Nocturne's steady hoofbeats. The air was still, heavy with the scent of pine and an underlying metallic tang. The silence was profound, yet attentive. Then came the whispers, faint at first, like the rustling of dry leaves. They slithered through the snow, emanating from everywhere and nowhere. They were sibilant sighs, mournful moans, the suggestion of voices broken by madness. Caine's pace did not falter. Suddenly, the rhythmic crunch of his steps changed. He heard another sound, a heavier crunching close by, then silence. The whispers ceased, the snowfall paused. Caine stopped, Nocturne froze. His hand drifted towards his revolver, scanning the darkness. The first of the beast's pawns had arrived. A man lunged from the dense thicket of skeletal trees. He was a grotesque caricature of a human being, clutching a heavy woodsman's axe. A low, guttural snarl ripped from his throat as he charged. Caine moved with a speed that belied his grim demeanor. He sidestepped the clumsy swing of the axe. As the man stumbled, Caine brought the butt of his revolver down on the man's wrist. The axe clattered to the ground. Caine didn't pause, breaking the axe's shaft over his knee. The man roared again, lunging with claw-like hands. Caine met the attack head-on, his fist slamming into the man's ribs. The man gasped, but still came, driven by an unnatural force. Caine pressed his advantage, producing a silver crucifix. He pressed it against the man's face, smoke billowing from the contact. The man thrashed, his strength faltering. Caine bound him to a tree, one less weapon for the Wendigo. No sooner had Caine secured the first attacker than the snow erupted nearby. A figure slithered out, moving with horrifying fluidity. It was a woman, her limbs bent at impossible angles. She crawled across the snow with terrifying speed. Her eyes were fixed on Caine with predatory intensity. She launched herself, tackling him with surprising force. Her weight was unnatural, heavy as stone. She scrabbled at him, trying to sink her teeth into his face. Caine struggled against her frenzied assault. He managed to get a hand free, shoving the obsidian talisman against her neck. The effect was instantaneous and violent. The woman shrieked, her body convulsing. Black smoke poured from her eyes, nose, and mouth. The obsidian talisman glowed with a faint heat. With a final twitch, her body went limp, the hunger within her banished. Caine pushed the lifeless form away, rising slowly to his feet. The forest seemed to watch, its silence more menacing. A new figure stepped into the clearing. It was a child, no more than 7 or 8 years old. The child walked with eerie slowness, its eyes blank, teeth filed into sharp points. A wave of cold washed over Caine. For a fraction of a second he hesitated. The child exploded into motion, launching itself at his throat. Caine reacted on instinct, throwing himself backward. He unstopped a vial of blessed earth, flinging its contents at the child. The child shrieked, thrown back into the snow. Caine pinned the thrashing body, whispering, "Forgive me." He drew a silver spike, driving it into the child's heart. There was no blood, only a final, fading shriek. He rose, the forest darkening further. He had reached the cave. The cave mouth yawned before Alucard Caine. It was a ragged wound in the mountainside. The darkness within was absolute. He paused at the threshold. The faint, cold breath he had felt on his neck was stronger here. This was the Wendigo's lair. This was the heart of the hunger that plagued Widow's Pass. He took a steadying breath. Stepping inside, the transition was stark. The silence here was different. The air was thick with the stench of old bones. His eyes slowly adjusted. The walls of the cavern were not smooth stone. They were covered in grotesque murals. Starving families reached skeletal hands towards nothing. Wolves with unsettlingly human eyes stalked through nightmarish landscapes. Caine drew his blessed blade. The dark steel seemed to absorb the faint ambient light. The runes etched into its surface pulsed with ancient power. On his wrist, the obsidian talisman began to grow warm. The heat intensified with each step. It was a burning brand against his skin. He pressed onward. From the oppressive darkness, something uncoiled. It moved with a horrifying, silent grace. Antlers scraped against the stone, hollow eye sockets fixed upon him. A low chorus of whispers filled the cavern. It was the sound of a dozen voices, a symphony of suffering. The Wendigo had revealed itself. It knew he was here. The Wendigo's voice, a chilling amalgamation of countless stolen whispers, slithered through the cavern's oppressive air. "We remember you," it hissed, the sound echoing from the bone-strewn floor to the jagged ceiling. Each syllable was laden with an ancient, knowing malice. The famine general, the impaler, the glutton, the creature's hollow sockets seemed to see not just Alucard Caine, the hunter, but the centuries of blood and sorrow that defined him. It saw Dracula. The Wendigo's whispers intensified, coiling around him like spectral tendrils, feeding on his resurrected pain. This was not a physical assault. It was an invasion of the mind, an attack on the very foundations of his being. The assault on Alucard Caine's mind was relentless. A torrent of his darkest memories weaponized against him. He saw himself not as the weary hunter Alucard Caine, but as Vlad the Impaler, the dragon. His fangs were bared, dripping with crimson. He was surrounded by the innocent, their faces pale with terror. He saw himself drinking their lifeblood, not for sustenance, but in rage and despair. This vision struck at the core of his defenses. It was the monster he constantly fought to keep chained within. The Wendigo's whispers became a chorus of condemnation. "You are one of us," they seemed to hiss. "You understand hunger." The heat from the talisman was an inferno, searing his flesh. He was adrift in a sea of his own making, drowning in blood. A scream, raw and animalistic, tore itself from Caine's throat. It was a sound of pure agony, echoing through the cavern. He dropped to his knees, his body trembling. The strength that had carried him through countless battles seemed to desert him. He was broken, not by claw or blade, but by the weight of his own immortal sins. The Wendigo watched, its hollow sockets gleaming with satisfaction. It had found his weakness, the cracks in his ancient facade. It had turned his own past into a weapon more potent than any physical attack. Caine remained on his knees, head bowed, the screams subsiding into sobs. The hunter was disarmed, vulnerable, lost in a private hell. The cavern seemed to grow colder, the shadows deeper, as if anticipating the final consumption of a fallen predator. From the depths of his despair, a spark ignited, a flicker of defiance. Alucard Caine was no stranger to torment. He had walked through hells both internal and external. The Wendigo's assault was brutal. It reminded him of the rage that fueled his hunt. Slowly, he pushed back against the damning visions. He forced himself to breathe, to focus. His eyes began to smolder with a cold, terrible light. He had fallen, but he would rise. With a guttural snarl, he reached for his saber. His fingers closed around the familiar grip. He pushed himself to his feet, purpose rekindled. He was Alucard Caine. He was Dracula, and he was a hunter. He lunged forward, the saber leading the charge. The Wendigo dodged with unnerving speed. Its claws lashed out, tearing through Caine's coat. Blood welled from the deep gashes. The pain fueled his fury. The dance began, a brutal symphony of swordplay. Caine's blade sang, seeking purchase on the creature. Caine managed to impale the beast's leg. The Wendigo shrieked, but did something horrifying. It snapped its own bone, tearing itself free. It slammed Caine against a bone-covered pillar. As he fell, his hunter's instincts took over. He drew his heavy Colt revolver. Mid-air, he fired 3 shots. Each round found its mark, punching into the Wendigo's spine. Section 5, In Morte Vindicta. The silver bullets staggered the Wendigo. It howled, but was not felled. Alucard Caine landed heavily, bleeding profusely. His talisman cracked, its power fading. He fed just enough to staunch his bleeding. His eyes glowed crimson, his fangs descended. He gripped his saber, its energy terrible. Caine launched himself, roaring, In Morte Vindicta. He drove the sword into the Wendigo's heart. The creature erupted in blue flame. The cave began to collapse. Section 1. The silence of a land unburdened. The blue flame of the Wendigo's demise consumed its unholy form. It devoured the bone murals. It licked at the ancient stones. The cavern groaned, a death rattle from the violated earth. Alucard Caine did not linger. He turned, stumbling through the cascading debris, his borrowed strength already beginning to wane. Dust and the screams of freed souls filled the air. He moved towards the faint promise of an exit, a pinprick of lesser darkness in the suffocating black. Each step was an agony. Each breath was a fire in his lungs. The battle was won. The price was steep. The mountain shuddered, a colossal beast in its death throes. Rocks the size of coffins crashed down from the collapsing ceiling. The very foundations of the Wendigo's lair were being torn asunder. Caine scrambled, his movements driven by a primal instinct for survival, the hunter becoming the hunted by the indifferent rage of the collapsing earth. He threw himself through a narrow fissure just as the main chamber imploded behind him, a final deafening roar sealing the Wendigo's tomb forever. The evil was contained. It was entombed beneath tons of unforgiving stone. The cursed ground was being reclaimed. Outside the now sealed cave, the forest seemed to exhale. The oppressive weight that had choked the trees, that had silenced the birds, began to lift. A faint breeze, clean and cold, rustled the pine needles. It carried the scent of snow and damp earth, no longer tainted by the charnel perfume of the Wendigo's presence. The whispers were gone. The unnatural heat in the ground had dissipated. The very air felt lighter, thinner, as if a great sickness had finally broken its fever. The land, scarred and brutalized, could begin its slow, silent process of healing. The spiritual poison that had seeped into Widow's Pass, emanating from this focal point of hunger, was neutralized. The souls, trapped for so long within the Wendigo's insatiable void, were finally free. They had dissolved into the ether, their suffering ended, their essence returning to the vast, indifferent cycle of existence. Though the physical scars on the land and its people would remain, the source of the deepest corruption was gone. The silence that descended was not of fear. It was a silence of exhaustion. It was the quiet after a long and terrible storm had finally passed. Alucard Caine emerged from the tree line as the first tentative fingers of dawn painted the eastern sky. Hues of bruised purple and blood orange bled across the horizon. He was a figure carved from shadow and moonlight, his clothes torn and stained. His limp was more pronounced now, each step a testament to the brutal encounter. Yet he stood tall, a solitary pillar of grim resilience against the breaking day. He had walked through the inferno. He had survived. Nocturne stood patiently at the edge of the clearing where he had left her. The black mare whickered softly as he approached, her dark eyes reflecting a deep, unwavering loyalty. She nuzzled his outstretched hand, a silent greeting, a shared understanding of the night's horrors. He leaned against her for a moment, drawing strength from her solid presence. The bond between them was ancient, forged in countless battles and lonely journeys. She was his one constant companion in a world that offered him little solace. He pulled himself into the saddle, his movements stiff and pained. He turned nocturne towards the distant, sleeping town of Widow's Pass. The ride was slow, measured. The rising sun cast long, skeletal shadows from the claw-marked pines. The world was slowly awakening, indifferent to the cosmic struggle that had taken place in its hidden depths. Birds began to tentatively chirp, their songs fragile notes in the vast, cold silence. This was the aftermath. This was the quiet that followed the storm of steel and sorcery. Within Caine, however, the storm had not entirely subsided. The victory was hollow, tainted by the methods he had been forced to employ. The echoes of the Wendigo's mental assault still whispered at the edges of his consciousness, dredging up centuries of guilt. The taste of the settler's life force, the surge of his own unleashed vampiric nature lingered like a brand. He had vanquished one monster, but the one within him was a constant companion, a shadow he could never fully outrun. The dawn brought light to the world, but his soul remained a landscape of perpetual twilight. As Alucard Caine rode nocturne down the main street of Widow's Pass, the town began to stir. Doors creaked open with hesitant curiosity. Faces appeared at windows, a mixture of awe and hope. The oppressive atmosphere had thinned. Townsfolk stepped into the morning light, knowing the nightmare was over. The silence was now one of reverence. It was not terror, but awe. The sheriff stood, his rifle leaning against the frame. He watched Caine approach, his face showing gratitude. He offered a slow nod. A small figure detached from the crowd. A child ran towards him, her hand outstretched. She stopped by Nocturne's side, looking up with wide eyes. In her hand, a single silver coin.
Mama says you saved us. Mama says you're the devil, but devils don't save people.
She held out the coin. Alucard Caine looked down at the child. He took the coin, his gloved fingers brushing hers. The silver felt cold against his skin. He held her gaze for a long moment. Then with a nod, he urged Nocturne forward. Devil or savior? Perhaps he was both, perhaps neither. He was simply Alucard Caine, and it was time to leave. As Alucard Caine rode out of Widow's Pass, his dark form a solitary silhouette against the brightening sky, the townsfolk watched him go in silence. Their gazes followed him until he was a distant speck, disappearing over the rise. But not all eyes that watched Caine's departure were filled with gratitude or innocent wonder. One pair observed him with a different kind of intensity. Standing in the shadowed doorway of the dilapidated church was a man. His face was lean, ascetic, his eyes burning with a cold, righteous fire. This was Father Graves. On his hip, stark against the black fabric of his cassock, was a heavy crossbow. His gaze was fixed on Caine's retreating figure, unwavering, analytical, and utterly devoid of mercy. He was a hunter of a different breed.